born and raised in Kentucky, in the same neighbourhood as world-famous boxer Muhammad Ali. She's a Grammy Award-winning composer and was also listed in the top 35 female composers in the Washington Post. She plays the flute and founded her own wind quintet called Imani Winds. This piece, Umoja, was written in 2001. Umoja is a Swahili word for unity, and the music has a really joyful feel to it. In this short video, we're going to explore how Valerie Coleman writes idiomatically for each instrument and the ensemble as a whole. This will help you understand the capabilities and characteristics of the instruments in a wind quintet and how best to use them in your own compositions. So, what does idiomatic writing mean in music? Well, idiom means a characteristic. So, writing idiomatically in terms of music means composing for instruments in such a way that accommodates and highlights their unique characteristics. For example, this could be in terms of the range of notes an instrument can play. It could be the dynamic capabilities of an instrument, or the breathing requirements for the musicians that play those instruments. For example, a flute can play really high-pitched notes beautifully, and a bassoon could never reach the high-pitched notes flutes can play, and perhaps is better suited to play in lower-pitched notes. So when you're composing, you first need to think about which instruments are actually capable of playing the music you've composed, and then which instruments would sound best playing them. Have a listen to the start of Umoja. It begins with the clarinet and oboe playing a short, high-pitched motif. After a few seconds, the flute comes in, playing even higher. Those three instruments work really well together and sound nice playing up there. Then we hear the bassoon, much lower down, playing a repeated rhythmic passage. Finally, we hear the French horn playing the main tune, which is nicely sandwiched in between the higher and lower pitch sounds played by the other instruments. Being a brass instrument, the French horn has got a very different sound quality to it than the other instruments in the wind quintet. So it's no coincidence that Coleman chose the French horn as the instrument to play her main melody the first time we hear it. When writing idiomatically, you also need to think about the dynamic capabilities of the instruments you're writing for too. For example, some instruments have a much wider dynamic range than others. Some instruments sound better playing louder than others. For example, brass instruments are well known for their loud fanfares, but that doesn't mean to say they can only play loud passages of music though. The French horn can have a beautifully mellow sound quality when it's played softly. The point is, you need to think about the overall effect, sound and feeling you're trying to create and choose the instruments that best suit that. I've explained a little about idiomatic writing for each individual instrument. There's also things to consider when writing idiomatically for a wind quintet ensemble as a whole. For example, you don't want all the instruments playing the same melody at the same time, all the time. So you need to think about what each instrument is doing at any moment during the piece. So which instruments are playing the melody and which instruments are providing the accompaniment? In Umoja, each instrument in the wind quintet gets its moment to shine and embellish on that original tune. In the following extract, Coleman uses a technique called call and response. This is where one group of instruments play a short melody, which is the call, and then another group of instruments play another melody after, which is called the response. Another thing to consider when writing for woodwind and brass instruments is when the musicians need to breathe, and that can be easy to forget when you're composing. So unlike on the piano, where you can play fast, rhythmic passages of music for a long period of time, a woodwind or brass player needs time in the music and space to breathe. When writing for woodwind or brass instruments, and thinking about when the musicians need to take a breath, you have to think about the ensemble as a team. For example, you might not want all the musicians taking a breath at the same time. Also, play with the different combinations of instruments in your ensemble, as you'll be able to achieve some really interesting blends of sounds. There are some techniques, sounds and effects that individual instruments can do that others cannot. For example, with string instruments, there's a technique called col legno. This is where the string instrument is played with the wooden side of the bow rather than the string side. And this creates a sort of percussive effect. There are some techniques and ways of playing that most instruments can do. For example, most instruments can play staccato, which means playing the notes in a detached way. Most instruments can play legato, which means playing the notes in a smooth way. But there are some sounds and effects and techniques that individual instruments can do that other instruments cannot. For example, in Umoja, you hear a technique called flutter tonguing, which is unique to brass and woodwind instruments. Flutter tonguing is when the musician rolls their R's as they play down the instrument. The overall effect depends on which instrument is playing it, at what pitch and which volume. Flutter tonguing can sound anything like a bird chirping to a raspy growl, often used in jazz music. Have a listen to this next passage of music and see if you can spot which instrument is flutter tonguing. There's another technique used in this piece called pitch bends. This is where the note bends slightly, either up or down in pitch. Another extended technique used by wind instruments is called key rattles, and this is where the player is required to make the sound of their fingers pressing against the keys, and this could be to a particular rhythm or at random. Another extended technique that can be used by woodwind and brass instruments is called multiphonics. This is where you can hear two notes played at the same time by just one of these instruments. Like whenever you're composing a piece of music, when you're using extended techniques, it's really important to consider the overall feel and mood you're trying to create. Why not experiment with new ways of playing your instrument, even if that's your own voice, and discover the exciting sounds they're capable of?